Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin. So I mentioned in a previous episode, or several of them, that my combination of computer setups is using Ubuntu Linux for many years with a brief detour into Fedora, but back to Ubuntu, and then on phone side I use Android. I've used Android for as long as I can remember owning a smartphone, except back in the day owning a BlackBerry. That was a while back. So I've always just bought Android devices, and you described it quite flatteringly as a classic power user combination. And I guess it makes sense that if you're into customizing, you're one of those people that like to get under the hood of your computer, Android is going to provide a bit of a better background than iOS, a bit less restrictive, even without rooting, which we should talk about, of course, in another podcast. But what I want to talk about today, Herman and Corin, is the actual Android that we end up running on our devices and alternatives to it. What I mean by that is I'm using a OnePlus at the moment on my phone, and before this it was Samsung, and each Android that I've owned for the past while, coming from one of the major vendors, actually runs something slightly different than vanilla Android. I believe OnePlus call it, and I could probably find this out by digging into the menu, but I don't want to lose this voice recording. Oxygen OS, and you have other ones. I'm just looking at a list here. One UI, the MIUI family. You've got Color OS and Oppo, Oxygen OS for OnePlus, as we mentioned, Pixel UI, and these apparently are called vendor skins. And I always wonder exactly why is it that vendors love these so much. Philanthropically, you might say, well, they're doing us a favor. They want to optimize the operating system for the hardware that they know they're building, and that is maybe a rather generous assessment, as I mentioned, because a lot of it seems to come down to stuffing the devices with bloatware, and sometimes, if not frank spyware, programs that actually are hard to remove except through ADB, and which seem a little bit dubious and shady. So my question, Herman and Corin, is if one wanted to find an Android device that was pre-rooted, but let's say, to be honest, I'm perfectly happy with a non-rooted device, but it would be lovely to buy a phone that was good in terms of the performance, and which came with just regular old-fashioned Android without bloatware at all, ideally, or at best only a very minimal amount of pre-installed apps on top of the operating system. And I'm curious whether there's any manufacturers in the world of Android that have taken that approach to user privacy, saying, we're going to give you something as close to vanilla Android as you can get. Nothing that you don't want. Here's your phone. Good luck. Pre-rooted phones are another topic, but we can defer that for our forthcoming conversation about phone rooting. But it struck me, Herman and Corin, that if you added up the number of Android devices that are made by OnePlus, Xiaomi, and the big manufacturers, that you might even find that the majority of the world's Android devices are actually not running true Android. Final part of the question, beyond Android itself, vanilla Android, the architecture that these boards are ARM64. What are the long tail of ROMs and distributions you can actually run on one of these? So there's a few options, I think, that the more savvy person who likes the freedom of Android but is exploring options ranging from rooting through to just buying a phone from someone that believes that the phone should be delivered to the consumer as minimally configured as possible, through to maybe even going into different operating systems entirely. What does a picture look like, and what are the options? Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. We are coming to you from a very sunny, surprisingly warm afternoon here in Jerusalem. The light is hitting the stone walls just right outside the studio window, and I am joined, as always, by my brother and our resident technical wizard.
Herman Poppleberry here. And I have to say, Corn, that sun is a bit of a tease because I have been buried in a dark room staring at code and hardware spec sheets for the new RISC-V development boards all morning. This podcast is quite literally my first interaction with the real world today, and it is a very welcome break.
It is funny you say that, because today's prompt from a listener named Daniel is right in your wheelhouse. It is a deep dive into the digital world that you spend so much time in. Daniel was writing to us about the current state of the Android ecosystem in early 2026. Specifically, he is frustrated with the way most major manufacturers like Samsung, OnePlus, and Xiaomi slap these incredibly heavy vendor skins over the base operating system. He is looking for that elusive vanilla Android experience, something that is clean, minimal, and respects user privacy without all the pre-installed bloatware we have become accustomed to.
Oh, the classic search for the clean slate. It is a quest many of us have been on for a long time, and honestly, it feels like it gets a little harder every year. It is interesting that Daniel mentions OxygenOS and One UI specifically. In 2026, those two represent very different philosophies of how to modify Android. Samsung's One UI 8.0 is this massive, feature-rich behemoth that tries to do everything for everyone, while OxygenOS has basically finished its transition into being a rebranded version of Oppo's ColorOS. They both end up in that same bucket for Daniel, though. They are just not what a purist wants.
Right, and Daniel wants to go even deeper than just the surface level. He is looking into alternative ROMs and even different operating systems entirely for ARM64 devices. So there's a lot to unpack here, from the mainstream to the very experimental. I want to start with the why though, Herman. Why is vanilla Android so hard to find in the wild? If you go buy a laptop today, you can usually get a pretty clean version of Windows, or you can just wipe the drive and install Linux in 20 minutes. Why is the mobile world so fundamentally different and locked down?
It really comes down to two things: differentiation and monetization. If you are a company like Samsung, you are not just selling a slab of glass and aluminum, you are selling an ecosystem. If your phone looked and behaved exactly like a Motorola or a Google Pixel, the only way you could compete would be on hardware specs and price. That is a race to the bottom where profit margins go to die, so they build One UI. They add their own calendar, their own mail app, their own app store, and now their own massive suite of AI assistants that are integrated into every corner of the OS.
But that leads directly to the bloatware problem Daniel mentioned. I mean, I just set up a new phone for a friend last week, and it was exhausting. Why does a modern phone need 2 different photo galleries, 2 different web browsers, and 3 different ways to take notes? It feels like the device is fighting you for control from the moment you turn it on.
It feels that way because, in a sense, it is. Those duplicate apps are not just there for your convenience, they are data collection points. And more importantly, they are often part of massive partnership deals. When you see Facebook or Netflix or TikTok pre-installed on a brand new phone and you find out you cannot delete them, only disable them, that is because the manufacturer got paid a significant amount of money to put them there. It helps subsidize the cost of the hardware, which is how they keep the sticker price competitive, but it comes at the cost of the user's storage, system resources, and, very often, their privacy.
So let's look for the exceptions for Daniel. Are there any manufacturers left in 2026 that actually give you something close to that vanilla experience out of the box?
It is a shrinking list, but they do exist. Ironically, the most obvious answer is the Google Pixel 10. Google's version of Android is often called stock by the general public, but technically it is not. It is what they call the Pixel UI. It has a lot of Google-specific features, especially the new Gemini AI integrations that you will not find in the Android Open Source Project or AOSP. But in terms of cleanliness, design consistency, and the lack of third-party bloatware like random mobile games or shopping apps, it is still the gold standard for most consumers.
What about companies like Motorola or Sony? I remember they used to be quite proud of their near-stock approach. Has that survived the last few years?
They are still holding the line to an extent. Motorola's Hello UI, which replaced their old My UX recently, is very light. They mostly just add some useful gestures, like that chop-chop motion to turn on the flashlight, which I still think is one of the best pieces of mobile UX design ever. Sony is also very close to stock, but they include some of their professional grade camera and cinema apps. The problem with those two is the update cycle. If you care about privacy and security, you want the latest patches the day they come out. Motorola has historically been a bit slow on that front compared to the 5 or 7 years of support you get from Samsung or Google now.
And then you have the boutique brands. I'm thinking of companies like Fairphone or TerraCube. Are they still viable options for someone like Daniel?
Absolutely. Fairphone is a great example, especially with the Fairphone 6 that just launched. Their whole philosophy is about longevity, repairability, and ethical sourcing, and that extends to the software. They provide a very clean version of Android, and they are one of the few companies that actively encourages you to unlock the bootloader. They make it very easy for you to install something else if you don't like what they provide. They see the software as something the user should own, not just rent.
Okay, so let's say Daniel wants to take it a step further. He mentioned user privacy as a primary priority. Even a clean version of Android from Google or Motorola is still deeply, fundamentally integrated with Google Play services. If you want to truly prioritize privacy and cut the cord with the big data harvesters, you're looking at custom ROMs, right?
Yes, and this is where the conversation gets really interesting and a bit more technical. If you have a supported device, which usually means a Pixel because of its open documentation, the absolute gold standard for privacy and security right now is GrapheneOS.
Wait, I have to stop you there for a second, Herman. It sounds completely counterintuitive to a regular user. You are telling me that Daniel should buy a Google-made phone just to install an operating system that is specifically designed to get away from Google.
It sounds like a paradox, I know, but there is a very sound technical reason for it. Pixels have the best hardware security features on the consumer market. I'm talking about the Titan M2 security chip and the way they handle verified boot. GrapheneOS leverages that hardware better than any other third-party ROM. It is a hardened version of Android. It strips out all the Google bits, no Play Store, no Google Maps, no tracking, but it has this incredible feature called Sandboxed Google Play.
Sandboxed? So it's not completely gone, it's just contained? Like a digital quarantine?
Exactly. On a regular Android phone, Google Play Services has privileged access. It sits at the system level and can see almost everything you do. GrapheneOS lets you install those services as regular apps with no special permissions. They can't see your files, your location, or your contacts unless you specifically grant them access, just like any other app. It gives you the compatibility of Android, meaning you can still run your banking apps or your work tools without the constant privacy invasion. It is a brilliant middle ground.
That seems like a massive win for someone who still needs to live in the modern world but doesn't want to be tracked. What about CalyxOS? I hear that name come up a lot in these privacy circles too.
CalyxOS is often described as the more user-friendly cousin of GrapheneOS. It uses something called micro-G, which is an open-source implementation of Google's proprietary APIs. It is a bit more focused on including privacy-preserving apps out of the box, like the DuckDuckGo browser and the Signal Messenger. It is great, but GrapheneOS is generally considered more secure by the hardcore community because of its hardening of the actual Linux kernel and the way it handles memory allocation to prevent exploits.
You mentioned earlier that the list of manufacturers is shrinking. It feels like the golden age of custom ROMs from 10 years ago, where you could put CyanogenMod on almost any phone you bought at the mall, is kind of over. Why has it become so much harder for the average hobbyist?
It is the cat and mouse game of hardware security, corn. Modern phones use a feature called verified boot. When the phone starts up, it checks the cryptographic signature of the operating system to make sure it hasn't been tampered with. This is fantastic for preventing malware from taking over your device, but it makes it very difficult for a hobbyist to install a custom ROM. If you unlock the bootloader to install something like LineageOS, you break that chain of trust. On most phones, once that chain is broken, you lose access to things like high-definition streaming or secure banking apps because the device no longer considers itself safe.
And that is why the Pixel is so popular for this, right? Because it actually allows you to relock the bootloader with your own custom keys.
Precisely. It is one of the few devices that lets you have your cake and eat it too. You get the custom, privacy-focused OS, and you get the hardware-backed security of a locked bootloader. Most other phones, once you unlock them, you're essentially lowering the physical security of the device to increase the software privacy. It is a tough trade-off that a lot of people don't realize they are making.
Let's pivot to the second part of Daniel's prompt. He asked about alternative operating systems for ARM64 devices that aren't Android-based at all. We are talking about the long tail of distributions. Where are we with True Linux on mobile in 2026? Is it actually usable yet?
We are in a much better place than we were 5 years ago, but I have to be honest with Daniel, it is still very much a tinkerer's paradise rather than a consumer-ready product. If you have a device like the PinePhone Pro or the Librem 5, you are running true, native Linux. We are talking about distributions like PostmarketOS, Mobian, and Arch Linux ARM. These aren't Android skins. They are the same kind of operating systems you would run on a desktop or a server.
PostmarketOS has a fascinating mission. I was reading their manifesto the other day. Their goal is basically to give a 10-year life cycle to smartphones, right? To stop them from becoming paperweights just because a company stops sending updates?
Yes. They want to combat electronic waste by making it possible to run a modern, secure Linux distribution on old hardware that the manufacturers have long since abandoned. It is based on Alpine Linux, which is incredibly lightweight. The challenge, as always, is the drivers.
Right. The blobs. You're always complaining about.
Exactly. Most smartphone components, the cellular modem, the Wi-Fi chip, the GPU, require proprietary binary blobs to function. In the Android world, those are baked into the vendor image. In the Linux world, developers have to spend thousands of hours reverse engineering them or trying to wrap them in a way that the Linux kernel can talk to them. This is why on many Linux phones, things like hardware accelerated video or even basic GPS can be flaky or non-existent. You might have a beautiful interface, but if you can't use the GPS to find your way home, it's a tough sell as a daily driver.
I've seen some videos of Ubuntu Touch lately. That project seems to have a lot of staying power despite its rocky history. I remember when Canonical tried to crowdfund a phone years ago, and it failed miserably.
It really did, but the community refused to let it die. After Canonical dropped it, the UBports community took it over, and they have done a heroic job. It is probably the most polished of the non-Android operating systems. It has a unique user interface based on scopes and edges that feels very different from the grid of icons we are used to on iOS and Android. It is very gesture-heavy and actually feels quite modern. They even have a decent app store now, though it's mostly web-based apps.
But that brings up the app gap problem. If Daniel is running Ubuntu Touch or Sailfish OS, can he actually live his life? Can he call an Uber? Can he check his bank balance or use his digital car key?
That is the million-dollar question, and for most people, the answer is no, or at least not easily. Most of these alternative OSs rely on web apps for those services. If the service has a good mobile website, you are fine. But if they require a specialized app with deep system integration for security, like a banking app that needs to verify your device's integrity, you are out of luck. There is a project called Waydroid, though, which allows you to run Android apps in a container inside Linux. It is getting better every month, but it is still a bit like running a marathon with a backpack full of bricks. It's heavy on the battery and not always smooth.
It sounds like the freedom Daniel is looking for comes with a very high maintenance tax. You get the freedom from tracking and bloatware, but you spend your Saturday mornings debugging while your microphone stopped working after a kernel update.
That is the reality of the frontier, corn. But for a certain type of user, the power user, Daniel mentioned, that trade-off is worth it. There is a profound sense of ownership when you know exactly what code is running on the device in your pocket. You aren't just a tenant in Samsung's or Google's garden, you are the master of your own hardware. You can look at the source code, you can compile your own kernel, and you can be certain that no one is selling your location data to a broker in the background.
I want to go back to the ARM64 aspect. In 2026, we are seeing ARM chips become the dominant architecture not just in phones, but in laptops and even some desktops. Does that convergence help the mobile Linux scene?
Massively. This is the silver lining. Because developers are now optimizing the Linux kernel and major desktop environments like GNOME and KDE for ARM processors in high-end laptops, those improvements trickle down to mobile devices. For example, the work done to make Linux run smoothly on the latest ARM-based laptops, means that we now have much better power management and memory handling for the same architecture on phones. We are seeing a mainlining effort where the code for these mobile chips is being integrated directly into the official Linux kernel, which makes everything more stable and easier to maintain.
So, if Daniel wants to go this route today, what is the most practical way to do it? If he wants a device that he can actually use as a daily driver but still feels like it belongs to him.
If he wants to stay in the Android ecosystem but maximize privacy, I would say get a Pixel 10 and install GrapheneOS. It is the most seamless experience that still offers a massive leap in privacy. It feels like a professional product. If he truly wants to leave Android behind and doesn't mind some rough edges, he should look at a Fairphone running Ubuntu Touch or even Sailfish OS. Sailfish is an interesting one because it's a commercial product from a Finnish company called Yoya. It's not fully open source, but it's not Google either, and it has a very elegant gesture-based UI that supports some Android apps natively.
It's interesting that we've come back to the hardware several times. It seems like you can't separate the software freedom from the hardware choice. If the hardware is locked down with proprietary keys and encrypted bootloaders, the software freedom is just an illusion.
That is the core of the issue. We have seen a trend towards software-defined hardware, where the manufacturer uses software locks to prevent you from truly owning the device you paid for. This is why projects like the Open Compute Project and the work being done by the Free Software Foundation are so important. They are trying to create a world where the owner of the device has the ultimate authority over what it does. We are even seeing some movement in the EU with the Digital Markets Act that might eventually force manufacturers to make it easier to install alternative operating systems.
We've talked about the big players and the niche Linux distributions, but what about the middle ground? Are there any de-Googled versions of regular Android that are easy to install for someone who isn't a kernel developer?
LineageOS is still the king of that middle ground. It is the descendant of the old CyanogenMod, and it supports hundreds of different devices. By default, it comes with 0 Google apps. You have to choose to install them. If you don't, you have a very clean, very fast, vanilla-feeling Android experience. The downside is that because it supports so many devices, the security model is a bit more relaxed than something like GrapheneOS. It doesn't always support relocking the bootloader, so you have to be aware of that physical security risk.
And what about the apps? If Daniel goes full to Googled LineageOS, where does he get his apps without the Play Store?
F-Droid is the place to start. It is a repository of free and open source software. You won't find Instagram or WhatsApp there, but you will find incredible open source alternatives for almost everything else, from maps to music players to office suites. For the apps you can't live without that are only on the Play Store, people use the Aurora Store. It is an open source client that lets you download apps from the Google Play Store anonymously without needing a Google account. It's a bit of a workaround, but it works surprisingly well.
That sounds like a pretty solid setup for someone who is ready to put in a little bit of work. It's funny, we started this talking about bloatware as a minor annoyance, but it really leads into this much deeper conversation about digital sovereignty and who actually owns our digital lives.
It really does. Bloatware is just the visible symptom of a deeper lack of control. When you can't delete an app that is eating your battery and watching your habits, it's a constant reminder that you don't fully own the device in your pocket. Taking that control back, whether it's through a light vendor skin, a custom ROM, or a native Linux OS, is an act of reclaiming your digital space. It's about setting boundaries with the companies that want to turn your life into a data stream.
I think that is a great way to frame it. It is about making the device work for you, rather than you being a product for the device manufacturer. It's a shift in the power dynamic.
Exactly, and I think we are seeing a growing awareness of this. Even if the vanilla options are hidden behind developer menus and forum posts, the fact that these communities are thriving and that projects like GrapheneOS are getting more stable every day shows that there is a real growing demand for a different kind of mobile experience. People are starting to realize that free services often come with a very high hidden cost.
Well, Herman, I think we've given Daniel and our listeners a lot to think about, from the practicalities of a Pixel with GrapheneOS to the frontier of PostmarketOS on a PinePhone. It's a spectrum of freedom, and everyone has to decide where they want to land on it based on their own technical comfort level.
Absolutely. It's all about knowing the trade-offs. I'm personally very excited to see where the ARM64 ecosystem goes in the next couple of years. The convergence of mobile and desktop is only going to make these alternative options more viable and more powerful. We might be closer to a truly open mobile world than we think.
Definitely. Well, that seems like a good place to wrap up our core discussion for today. Before we get into the final takeaways, I just want to say, if you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird and wonderful world of tech and prompts, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps other people find the show and helps us keep the lights on.
It really does. We love seeing the community grow and hearing your feedback.
Alright, let's talk practical takeaways. If someone is listening to this and they are fed up with their current phone's bloatware, what are the first 3 steps they should take?
First, check if you can actually disable the bloatware you have. On most modern Android phones in 2026, even if you can't uninstall a system app, you can disable it in the settings. This stops it from running in the background, prevents it from collecting data, and hides it from your app drawer. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a zero-cost 5-minute fix that can significantly improve your experience.
And if they want to go a step further without flashing a new OS?
Step 2 would be to look into a different launcher. Apps like Nova Launcher or the newer Niagara Launcher can completely change the look and feel of your phone. They can make a Samsung or a Xiaomi feel much more like vanilla Android by giving you control over the icons, the gestures, and the app drawer. It doesn't remove the underlying bloat, but it changes your daily interaction with the device and makes it feel much more yours.
And step 3, the nuclear option for the brave.
Step 3 is research. Go to the XDA developers forums or the subreddits for your specific phone model. See if your bootloader can be unlocked and what the custom ROM scene looks like. Look for terms like official support for LineageOS or GrapheneOS, but be warned, this can void your warranty and, if you're not careful, you can brick your phone, turning it into a very expensive paperweight. Do your homework, read the guides twice, and always back up your data before you start flashing anything.
Great advice. And I would add a step 4, if you are in the market for a new phone, but with your wallet. Look at companies like Fairphone or even Google, which at least give you a cleaner starting point and a clear supported path to more software freedom if you choose to take it later.
Well said, Korn. The market only changes when the consumers demand it.
So, looking ahead, Herman, do you think we will ever see a major manufacturer embrace true vanilla Android again, like the old Google Play Edition phones we had back in the day? I really miss those.
I would love to see it, but I'm skeptical. The business model of the big players is so tied to their software ecosystems and the AI services they are building now. I think the freedom will continue to come from the fringes and from the community-driven projects. But as those projects get more polished and easier to use, they might start to influence the big players. We've seen it happen before. Features that started in custom ROMs eventually made their way into the official version of Android because they were just better.
It's the classic open source as the research and development department for the entire industry model.
Exactly. The enthusiasts pave the way, and the mainstream eventually follows, even if they do it slowly and reluctantly.
Well, this has been a fascinating look at the state of mobile freedom in 2026. Thanks to Daniel for sending in that prompt. It really touched on something that I think a lot of people feel, but don't always know how to articulate. That sense of, I just want my phone to be a tool, not a billboard.
Precisely. A tool that you own, not a tool that owns you.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can find everything you need at myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed for subscribers and a contact form if you want to send us your own thoughts or a prompt you want us to explore. You can also reach us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com.
And of course, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you get your audio fix. We are everywhere.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. I'm Korn.
And I'm Herman Poppleberry.
We will see you in the next episode. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.